Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Between Two Worlds. I'm your host, Annika, and today we are diving deep into a territory that might make some of you uncomfortable, maybe curious, excited, or even all of the above. And that is necromancy. Necromancy, graveyard magic, and really just the rich traditions of working with the dead. Some of you, I am sure, understand the difference between real life necromancy and the zombie raising rituals from Hollywood. Or you could be picturing maybe black robes, desecrated graves, and some kind of ritual to reanimate corpses. But that is not quite it either. The real practices of necromancy truly have existed for thousands of years in different ways across different cultures. So, why am I talking about this topic now? Well, first, I think it's time we reclaim some of these misunderstood practices from both Hollywood and religious fear-mongering. But more personally, I've been working with ancestral magic quite a lot lately, and I've noticed how many people, even experienced witches, get really uncomfortable when graveyard work is mentioned. And while I just truly like to tackle those kind of topics, there is, this immediate barrier that kind of goes up, the sense of we're crossing some forbidden line for most, or for very few of you. Often, it is one of the things that gives witchcraft its really evil, quote, stigma. And yes, if we look at folk magic traditions across the world, working with the dead is one of the most fundamental universal practices, from Mexico to Eastern Europe to Appalachia to West Africa. Connecting with those who have crossed over is central to magical work. So today, I want to break down the stigma, offer some historical context, share personal experiences, and most importantly, give you practical and ethical ways to incorporate this powerful magic into your own practice if you feel called to it. So let's start by understanding what necromancy actually is, historically speaking, at least. The word comes from the Greek nekros, meaning the dead, and mantia, meaning divination. So obviously, this literally translates its meaning divination by communicating with the dead, right? That's it, seeking wisdom, guidance, or information from those who have passed on. In ancient Greece, necromancy was practiced at specific oracular sites. I can never really say that word, but in Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus performs this ritual to speak with the shade of the prophet Tiresias for guidance. This wasn't really seen as evil, it was seen as accessing wisdom from beyond the veil. And even in the Bible, yes, the Bible, we find the story of the Witch of Endor, which I've talked about before, who King Saul seeks out to communicate with the spirit of the prophet Samuel, which divination was generally forbidden in biblical law. The story itself doesn't portray the witch as evil, just someone with the ability to communicate with the dead. But what's fascinating is that necromancy appears across virtually every ancient culture in some form, right? In ancient Egypt, the entire Book of the Dead was essentially a guide to navigating the afterlife and maintaining connections between the worlds. The Egyptians didn't see death as an ending, but as a transformation, with continued interaction between the living and the dead. Their elaborate tomb practices weren't just about preservation of the body, but about creating a conduit for ongoing relationships. In pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, the Aztec and the Mayan cultures maintained sophisticated practices of ancestor communication. The tzitzime, or I think that's how you say it, excuse me, but they are these female ancestral deities associated with the stars, were regularly consulted for wisdom. Far, far from being feared, these practices were central to community cohesion and identity. Death was seen as simply another phase of existence and not this severance of relationship. And the Romans, too. They had formalized necromantic practices, particularly during the festival of Lumeria in May. During this time, the head of the household would perform specific rituals to appease and communicate with the spirits of the dead. They would walk barefoot at night, wash their hands 3 times, throw black beans behind them while speaking specific incantations to honor and address ancestral spirits. Again, this wasn't considered dark or forbidden. It was just civic, and it was a religious duty. So when did necromancy really get this sinister reputation? The shift really happened with the rise of Christianity, particularly during the medieval period in Europe. The church had a vested interest in being the sole intermediary between people and the spiritual realm. Any practice that allowed direct communication with spirits, especially deceased loved ones, threatened that monopoly on spiritual access. This demonization intensified dramatically during the witch hunt era of the 15th through 17th centuries. Talked about it before. The Malleus Maleficarum, one of the most influential witch hunting manuals, specifically targeted anyone with immediate intimate knowledge of these death transitions, which had once made them really valued community members, now just made them suspects. So if you do want more of a deep dive on the Malleus, I do have an episode dedicated to it. But I digress. So we can see this transformation in how the imagery around death communicated changed really. So earlier European folk practices around death, like the tradition of sin eaters who would ritually consume food placed on a corpse to absorb the deceased sins, or the practice of keeping death vigils where family members would speak directly to the departed, were gradually replaced with these priest-led services where the clergy alone could address the dead or speak about their fate. This intimate, direct relationship with the dead was systematically severed and replaced with institutional intermediaries. This fear-based reframing of necromancy has had its lasting psychological effects. Many of us, even those who consider ourselves witches or magical practitioners, really, I think, still carry an unconscious unease around death work. Maybe not most of us, but definitely some of us. We've internalized this idea that there's something inherently dangerous or maybe even wrong about speaking directly with the dead, despite the fact that our ancestors across cultures did so regularly as part of a healthy spiritual practice. Recognizing this conditioning is the first step towards reclaiming these ancient forms of connection. Right? So the colonial lens further distorted uh, folk practices and indigenous around death in many cultures across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, and pre-Christian Europe. Ancestor veneration was central to spiritual life. When colonial powers and missionaries encountered these practices, they were often labeled as devil worship or black magic, which I hope I will be talking about next because the words and labeling of white and black magic, I think, is a huge deep dive and it gets pretty juicy. But so this all began to impose their own fear-based interpretation on what were actually reverent, community-oriented traditions. So necromancy is not about controlling or manipulating the dead. It's not about raising zombies. It's not about disturbing or disrespecting the dead. Real necromantic practice is built on relationship, respect, permission, and exchange. And it's hard. Necromancy is about recognizing that death is not the end of a relationship, it's a transformation. Those who have crossed the veil still have wisdom to share, protection to offer, and connections to maintain with the living. Working with the dead acknowledges the continuum of existence rather than seeing death as a final ending. So let's look at how these practices show up in more folk traditions around the world, because this is where it gets pretty fascinating and practical. So in Appalachian folk magic and Southern root work, or even conjure traditions, graveyard dirt is a powerful ingredient in many workings. While that may be its origins, graveyard dirt by no means is anything but closed. Anyone can work with graveyard dirt as long as you take the right moral, ethical protocols. Um, so you never just take it, right? You ask permission, both from the cemetery itself and often from a specific grave. You leave payment, traditionally a dime or some other coin. You have specific purposes in mind, right? Different graves are approached for different magical purposes. For example, the grave of a soldier might be visited for protection work, while the grave of a loved one might be approached for healing or blessing. The dirt from a grave of someone known for honesty might be used in court cases to ensure truth comes to light. There's lots of room here. In these graveyard traditions, there's also this practice of sitting up with the dead, keeping vigil with the corpse before burial, not just as a mark of respect, but as an active magical working. During these vigils, the watchers would directly address the deceased, asking them to carry messages to others who have passed, requesting protection for the family, or seeking guidance about unresolved matters, maybe. I know we've all heard about the whole mirrors are portals, but these mirrors would be covered not only for out of respect, but also because there was this kind of understanding that they were potential passageways between the worlds that needed to be managed carefully during a specific liminal time. I know Pennsylvania Dutch traditions too give us the practice of using grave rubbings in protective workings. So this would be a piece of paper placed over a headstone and rubbed with charcoal or wax, which would capture the name and the dates of the deceased. This paper could then be incorporated into protective amulets for the home. The folk belief was that the deceased would act as this guardian for the household, particularly if they shared a family name or had been known for their protective nature in life. So, regular visits to family graves aren't just about remembrance. They're active magical workings. Food and drink are left, graves are tended and decorated, and direct communication happens between the living and the dead. There's also this tradition of the memorial meal, where a place is set at the table for the deceased with food and drink and remains untouched by the living, but it is understood to provide sustenance for the visiting spirit. This is, as you would say, a dumb supper. These aren't merely symbolic acts, though, but it's an active necromantic practice, right? These active necromantic practices kind of live everywhere when we truly look at the details, creating deliberate channels for communication and this exchange. Mexican practices around Dia de los Muertos shows us another beautiful approach, right? I think that might be one of the most iconic festivals of the dead. The dead aren't feared, they're celebrated, fed, honored with these altars, which are called ofrendas, and invited into the home. The graveyard becomes a place of reunion and celebration, with families literally picnicking at their ancestors' graves, which I actually have done before. What's particularly powerful about Dia de los Muertos is how it blends this pre-Columbian practice with Catholic influences to create something that really preserved the essence of necromantic work within a nominally Christian framework. The marigolds used to decorate graves aren't just decorative, they are believed to attract and guide spirits with their vibrant color and their scent. The sugar skulls aren't morbid, right? They're a way of familiarizing children with the concept of death as a natural part of life. Personal items placed on ofrendas serve as magical links to specific deceased individuals, drawing their particular energy back into the family circle. And also many West African traditions that later influenced practices in the Caribbean and Americas. Ancestors aren't just remembered, they're actively present in community life. We kind of have a recurring theme here, right? Consulted for decisions and believed to intervene even on behalf of the living. Libations, offerings, and regular communication maintained these relationships. So, graveyard dirt. This is collected with permission and payment, used for protectin, or protection, for binding connection to specific virtues of the deceased, even. There are grave goods, which is going to be your coins, your alcohol, especially I find whiskey or rum. Um, I know most spirits are centuries and centuries and centuries old, but I don't know, there's something about whiskey and rum that kind of, is a little bit of everybody's flavor. Also, there's tobacco. Most corpses or deceased and spirits love themselves a good cigarette. Flowers, water, honey, and favorite foods are often used. There's crossroads. This is very liminal, very necromantic. The intersection between the worlds, right? Often associated with both graveyard work and communication with spirits. You can work with specific timing, like working at dawn, at dusk, during the dark moon, or on festival days associated with the dead. Candles, which are used, are often white, black, or just specific colors associated with the deceased or the particular working. And personal items. We have photos, belongings, and written names of the deceased to strengthen this connection. Beyond these common elements, there are also specific mechanisms for establishing boundaries in necromantic work. Many traditions include practices for closing the door after communication, whether that's ritually sweeping the threshold after ancestors have been invited in for a feast, using specific dismissal prayers or thanks, or creating physical markers like lines of salt or ash to delineate the space of communication. These aren't meant to banish the dead in a fearful way, but it's to maintain a healthy boundary between the worlds. Especially as magical people, this is extremely important. Recognizing that both the living and the dead have their own domains that should be respected. While folk traditions offer many accessible ways to work with the dead, traditional witchcraft contains additional, often more formal approaches to necromantic practice, right? These techniques draw from grimoire traditions, cunning craft, and other historical European magical systems that were often preserved in fragmentary or coded forms during periods of prosecution. The witch's compass or circle has specific applications in necromantic work. While many modern practitioners use the circle primarily for protection, in traditional practice it serves as a liminal space, a deliberate crossing point between worlds. When cast specifically for necromantic purposes, the circle creates a meeting ground where the living and the dead can safely interact. Traditional circle castings for this purpose often include elements like marking the four cardinal directions with specific herbs associated with the dead, and transitions such as mugwort, wormwood, yew, cypress, placing black candles at the quarters rather than colored ones associated with the elements, creating a specific gate or opening in the west, traditionally associated with death and ancestors in many European systems, through which spirits are invited to enter. There is also Book of Shadows approach to necromancy. Often, this includes specific ritual formats for different types of spirit communication, which might include mediumship rituals for general communication with the deceased, specific ancestral invocations to call upon, power and wisdom of one's lineage. There's crossroad rituals for communicating with the specific categories of the dead, such as those who died violently or those with particular knowledge. There's protocols for summoning, questioning, and dismissing spirits in formal ritual settings. And there's scrying. Scrying features prominently in traditional necromantic methods. While crystal balls are the most familiar tool, traditional witchcraft often employs things like black mirrors, specifically consecrated for communicating with the dead, bowls of ink or dark water, sometimes collected from specific sources like cemetery fountains, if your cemetery is so lucky to have one. There's smoke scrying, where the patterns in the incense smoke are interpreted as messages. There's fire gazing, particularly flames fed with specific woods or herbs associated with necromancy. All of these are seriously among my favorite. Even though I do engage in a lot of folk practice, I definitely lean more towards traditional witchcraft for sure. So, the witch's familiar concept has deep connections to necromantic practice in traditional witchcraft. The familiar spirit, whether perceived as an animal, a human like entity, or simply a presence, often serves as an intermediary between the witch and the realm of the dead, right? These familiars are not always just your pet dog or your pet cat. The familiar spirit is something a little bit different. Traditional practices for working with a familiar in necromantic context can include sending your familiar spirit ahead as a scout or messenger to the other world. I love this. I regularly use a familiar spirit as a scout for multiple aspects in my magical life. Using the familiar as a protective guide during spirit communication, even you can allow the familiar to act as a filter or a translator for messages from the dead. This is also very useful, especially when you're first getting into necromancy. You can create specific pacts or agreements with the familiar about their role in death work, which all of this could be similar to um, servitors if you also work with those. Traditional Sabbath celebrations, too, often incorporate specific necromantic elements that many modern practitioners have lost or watered down. For example, Samhain traditions included not just honoring the dead, but active divination with their assistance. The Wild Hunt legends also connected the winter solstice, contained protocols for either avoiding or joining the procession of the dead. Even Beltane. Beltane's focus on fertility, which we just had Beltane, had a shadow aspect, dealing with those who died before their time. Midsummer traditions in some areas included specific workings to communicate with those who had drowned, as the boundary between water and air, like the boundary between life and death, was considered thinnest at this time. And hedge crossing, the practice of deliberately traversing the boundary between worlds and trance, right? I love talking about hedge crossing and trance work. It is perhaps the most direct form of necromantic work in traditional witchcraft. And this includes specific flying ointments, right? We talked about before. Please check out my other episode. But I will repeat some here. The herbs that are associated with both trance and death, such as nightshades, henbanes, or mandrakes, these are now recognized as extremely dangerous and toxic. Uh, I'm not saying not to use them, but don't use them, if you get what I mean. Rhythmic techniques, including drumming, chanting, and dancing to specific cadences, also. Breathing methods that alter your consciousness, the use of specific postures or physical positions to facilitate astral or spirit travel. There's also visualization. I am a huge visualizer. It's always been my go-to. I know some people don't have that capability, but visualization pathways specifically designed to lead to the realm of the dead are particularly helpful. There's also this role of bones, right? I also love talking about bones. I did a whole episode on that too. In traditional necromantic witchcraft deserves a special mention here. While modern practitioners may use symbolic representations, traditional craft often employed actual bones as a tool of power and connection. And that could be bone divination, your osteomancy, where the patterns of scattered bones would be interpreted, creating ritual tools incorporating bones of specific animals associated with death or psychopompic qualities, like ravens, your owls, or black dogs, or cats. You know, there's lots there. The controversial and largely historical practice also of using human remains. While this is possible, um, if you do engage in this, obviously please do your research to the world's end on where you're sourcing these things, but particularly from executed criminals or unbaptized children, traditionally, and certain European grimoire traditions. The more accessible modern adaptation of working with ethically sourced bones from animals to create connections to their spirit allies and communicating with the human dead, right? So it's important to note here that while I'm sharing these traditional practices for educational context, many of them require specific or significant training, I should say, preparation, discernment. Traditional witchcraft approaches to necromancy aren't necessarily better than folk approaches. They're simply different modalities with their own requirements and own considerations. For many practitioners, beginning with the folk methods and gradually incorporating elements of traditional craft as their experience deepens is the most balanced approach to this powerful work. So before we go any further, let's talk about the very practical aspects of graveyard work. What I think of as cemetery etiquette, right? Because this isn't just about magical safety, I should say. It's about physical safety too. There's legal considerations and basic respect. First, the practical stuff. Most cemeteries have opening hours. Many are private property. Trespassing at night with candles and herbs might not just get you an unwanted spirit attention, but it could also potentially get you arrested, depending on where you are in your specific situation. But I just want to stress here, know the rules of the cemetery that you're going to be visiting. Second, respect the physical space. Don't step on graves if you can avoid it. Don't disturb headstones or decorations left by families. Be mindful of your volume and never ever damage or deface anything. Third, please respect the spiritual space. Always announce yourself when entering a cemetery. Literally speak aloud your name and your intentions. Ask permission to be there, especially if you are at a cemetery which you do not have a family member at. Please just listen for any intuitive response that suggests that you shouldn't proceed or should move to a different area. So when it comes to collecting your graveyard dirt or working with specific graves, always ask permission from both the cemetery at large and from the specific grave. Leave an appropriate payment. Traditionally, a coin, though some practitioners also leave alcohol, tobacco, flowers, depending on the tradition, and really just your relationship. Only take what you need. This should be obvious for all things when you're gathering materia. And be specific in stating what you'll use it for. This one, I would stress, is sometimes a little bit more important than when you are gathering plant materia, because first, plant spirits are a lot different than human spirits, and a lot of times they want to be informed on what they're going to be used for. Never take from a fresh grave, generally less than a year old, or from children's graves, unless you have a direct connection to that specific child. Some practitioners avoid taking dirt from graves of people who died violently or tragically, as their energy may be unsettled, but some specifically reach for this graveyard dirt, depending on what your working is going to be. For those new to graveyard work, I recommend starting with visits during daylight hours, graves of family members or historical figures with whom you feel a positive connection to, simple offerings and communication rather than complex workings. Have a clear cleansing practice for when you leave, too, which brings me to another important aspect: transitions in and out of the cemetery, right? Many traditions emphasize the importance of having clear boundaries between cemetery work and your regular life. This might include things like a specific prayer or chant when entering and leaving, washing your hands with Florida water or other cleansing substance before leaving. You can make a specific wash for this. Having dedicated clothing for cemetery work that you change out of before returning home, or shoes. Leaving through a different gate than the one that you entered, if this is possible. Many cemeteries only have one entrance and exit, and not looking back once you've left. These aren't just superstitions, they are psychological boundaries that help you compartmentalize this work and prevent unwanted energies from following you home. I grew up familiar with cemeteries, thanks again to my abuela, where we would often go to have a quiet lunch. And I grew up knowing that they were beautiful places for remembrance, love, and communication. We went to our local cemetery to visit a couple of family members quite often. And of course, I always wanted to go to the pet cemetery, even though I didn't have a pet buried there. I just always remember I didn't want to leave the animals out either. So after we were done at the normal cemetery, we would head over to the pet cemetery. So, really, the dead, in my experience, aren't scary. They've never really been scary. And I know not everyone gets that privilege, and many people are overcoming that now in life. They're not lurking around waiting to possess or harm the living. They're simply in another phase of existence with a different perspective that can sometimes help us navigate our challenges. So, let's talk about some specific ways you can begin incorporating these practices into your own work, starting with approaches that don't even require a cemetery visit. Ancestor altars. Perhaps the most accessible form of necromantic work in creating a dedicated space in your home to honor and communicate with your ancestors. This obviously can include photos of your loved ones, objects that belong to them or even represent their interests, candles. White is very traditional in many cultures. Fresh water, refreshed regularly, offerings of food, drink, tobacco, flowers, written names of ancestors whose images you don't possess. The key to an effective ancestor altar is regular attention. This is huge with all necromantic work, I find, just personal experience here. This isn't a set it and forget it magical tool. Light the candles regularly, refresh the water, talk to your ancestors, ask for their guidance, tell them about your life. This is where we can really connect the ancient cultural traditions and just modern life, is keeping the connection there just by simply engaging them. This consistent relationship building is just the foundation of effective ancestral magic. So, other than ancestral magic, there's also dream work when it comes to necromancy. Throughout history, dreams have been seen as a primary way the dead communicate with us, right? You can intentionally invite ancestors to guide you in your dreams through maybe keeping dream journals by your bed, creating a specific invocation before sleep, asking a particular ancestor for guidance. You can place photos or objects connected to the ancestor under your pillow, recording and analyzing dreams for messages or symbols. And there's also divination. So, traditional necromancy often involved divination to receive messages from the dead. You now can adapt this by maybe dedicating specific divination tools. Many people find having a specific deck of cards or a pendulum specifically for ancestral communication or just general necromancy works best. Opening divination sessions with an invocation to a specific ancestor or your lineage, asking direct questions about what guidance they can offer, and also just looking for signs in your environment after requesting their input. This works for a lot of different kind of spirit work. After you're working, notice the changes in your life. So after that, let's talk about gravesite work. If you do feel ready to work in a cemetery itself, I kind of want to share some beginner-friendly practices. So there's cemetery photography. Many cemeteries have historic sites with beautiful artwork and architecture. Photography can be a respectful way to connect to the space, really. Obviously, check the rules first. And there's also grave tending. A lot of people love to do this. I find it very therapeutic. It's a good way just to keep up a necromantic practice. Um, and this would be cleaning family gravestones, pulling weeds, leaving flowers. If your gravesite, we're not talking about your gravesite here, if your cemetery allows, you can even do this to non-family member gravestones. You can engage in peaceful meditation while just simply sitting quietly in a cemetery to really just attune to its unique energy. And there's also name recitation. Reading the names from headstones aloud is really just a powerful way to honor those who might otherwise be forgotten. I know I just recently visited my local cemetery, and one thing that stood out to me was just the emptiness, and I could just feel it. And I plan to go back. And while I was there, I did just want to make it known that someone was here to honor and recognize that they were also there. So, for your graveyard dirt actual collecting, and you are ready to move on to collecting your dirt, bring a small container with a lid and a coin, traditionally a dime. I would say you could bring other offerings too, but a coin is probably most accessible. Enter the cemetery respectfully, obviously, right? Announce yourself and your purpose. Find an appropriate grave based on your intention, your family member, maybe someone with qualities you seek, or it might just be general cemetery dirt. Ask permission aloud, right? You want to take the small amount from the grave or the site, and you also want to let them know that you are giving an offering in fair exchange. If you feel a positive response, or at least not a negative one, place the coin on the grave. Collect a small amount from the dirt near the headstone, maybe. Some traditions specify the foot of the grave is for different purposes. And then thank the deceased and the cemetery itself before leaving. This dirt can be used in protection pouches, court case spells, ancestor connection work. There's tons of stuff we already talked about. As with any magical practice, ethics are paramount in necromantic work. Perhaps even more so because you're engaging with beings who may be vulnerable in certain ways and powerful in others. First, consent matters, right? We talked about just ask permission. Listen for any signs of refusal, uncomfortable feelings, maybe sudden obstacles, or intuitive messages. Not every spirit wants to work with you, and that is a boundary that needs to be respected. Second, consider the cultural context. If you're drawing on practices from traditions not of your own ancestry, do so with research, respect, and obviously proper attribution. Be especially mindful that you're not stepping on any toes when it comes to closed practices or those from cultures that have experienced colonization and appropriation. I know this can get really into some muddy water here, but just be mindful. Third, be honest about your relationship with the deceased. Working with your own ancestors or those with whom you had a living connection with is generally more straightforward than approaching strangers, just like you would in your living life. If you feel called to work with a historical figure or someone you didn't know in life, approach with extra respect and care. Fourth, I would say be mindful of your intentions. Necromantic work for healing, guidance, protection, or honoring is generally well received. Work aimed at maybe more baneful things like manipulating, causing harm, or driven by unhealthy obsession can open other doors, many problematic. Some specific boundaries to consider might be avoid working with the very recently deceased. Most traditions suggest waiting at least a year as their transition may still be in the process. Many of these recently deceased might not even recognize that they're deceased. There's a whole lot that goes in here. So also be cautious of those who died violently, tragically, or even by suicide. Their energy may be unsettled, or they may need more space or peace more than engagement. Never attempt to bind or control spirits of the dead. Relationship is about mutual respect. Be especially careful about working with the graves of people from cultures with specific funerary practices about which you may be unaware of. Perhaps most importantly, know your own boundaries. No, necromantic work isn't for everyone at every point in their journey. If you are in active grief, emotionally unstable, or experiencing mental health challenges that affect your perception of reality, it might be wise to focus on other magical practices for now. For those who have experienced religious trauma, necromantic work can be particularly healing precisely because it often represents everything we were taught to fear. In many controlling religious environments, death is weaponized. It's used as a threat, eternal damnation, quote, as a separation, parentheses, you'll never see your loved ones again unless you follow these rules, or as fearful mystery that only the religious authorities can interpret for you. Natural human grief is often complicated by dogmatic ideas about where the deceased has gone and whether they're suffering or not. Reclaiming a direct personal connection to our beloved dead can be profoundly healing. It obviously challenges the narrative that we need intermediaries to connect with the spiritual realm. It affirms our innate ability to maintain bonds of love beyond the physical, and it often reveals that the dead are not suffering in some horrific afterlife. They are just continuing their journey in ways that can still include connection with us. If you're working through religious trauma, necromantic practices can be a gentle way to test and challenge those ingrained fears. Start small, perhaps with a simple ancestor altar, with dream work, or with a daylight visit to a loved one's grave where you speak honestly about your journey. You may be surprised to find that connecting with the dead doesn't bring the divine punishment or demonic attention you were taught to fear. Instead, it often brings a sense of continuity, support, and connection that helps heal the very wounds that religious trauma created. So, as we wrap up today's exploration, I want to emphasize that necromancy and graveyard work aren't about being, quote, spooky or edgy. While you might feel that way, that's not what it's about, right? They're about maintaining the connections that make us human across the threshold of death. They're about recognizing that wisdom, love, and guidance continue to flow between worlds when we create space for that exchange. Whether you decide to create an altar for your ancestor, visit a loved one's grave with renewed intention, practice dream work with your ancestors, or simply begin to question the fear based narratives about death and spirit communication you may have internalized, you are participating in one of humanity's oldest spiritual practices, witchcraft or not. The veil between worlds has never been as thick or impermeable as some would have us believe. Our ancestors, both of blood and of spirit, are often just waiting for us to remember how to listen. So, I personally would love to hear your experiences with necromantic work, your questions or hesitations. Connect with me on Instagram. Yes, I have an Instagram now, Between Two Worlds. I think it's in my show notes. I know I have comments on. I also have my email, my podcast description. So please continue the conversation if you can. And as always, whether you are new or a returning listener, I just want to personally thank you for a moment. Thank you for joining me and listening to me blab and blab and blab on. Yeah, so wherever you may be, have a wonderful morning, day, or night.